Okay, we are finally back to Radicals for Capitalism. And this was a long chapter. And it was chapter 7, I believe. One second here. Yes. Though I do have some things marked up on chapter 6, but I am pretty sure that we had gone over that. I must have things there I want to look up. But here we are, chapter 7, which is entitled, get my mic closer, hopefully you heard the beginning, Libertarian Zionism, the Koch Bubble, and America's third largest political party, LP, yay! All right, so, and this chapter goes for about 50 pages, but there is a lot of information. All right, so here are the quotes we're going to talk about, and then that I've highlighted. So it says that goddamn Nixon had finally done it. Appeared on TV on August 15th, 1971, with his dark, shifty mug, no face that Ayn Rand or Robert Heinlein would ever glorify, and announced that he was going to dictate to all Americans how much they could charge for things they wanted to sell and how much they could be paid for the work they did. This is the wage and price controls. That was actually the final nail in the coffin's not the right way, because that makes us, it was the last straw. That's what I'm looking for. The last straw that formally launched, you know, a hardcore movement to start the Libertarian Party. They had already had talks about it, but this was really the last straw. And they were meeting to discuss the future LP at Nolan's house in Westminster when this news broadcast came on, by the way. And while he was at it, he was going to take the dollar completely off the gold basis. The American dollar would henceforth be nothing but a piece of paper, redeemable in nothing. It was an act of economic tyranny so sinister that it was worthy of the craven national leader in Atlas Shrugged. And we let them get away with it. It's unbelievable to me. And it's unbelievable to me the chutzpah that these politicians have. That they think they have these rights to do these kinds of things. It's just gross. And it goes on to Heinlein's influence in the early LP. It says Heinlein was not an across-the-board doctrinaire movement libertarian, but his novels frequently had hyper-individualist messages combined with an intelligent and critical sniffing at hidebound traditions. He was personal friends with Robert Lefebvre, to boot, and based a character in his influential Libertarian Revolution on the Moon novel, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress on Him. He was also a multi-year road veteran of the Liberty Amendment campaign. Oh no, now it's going on to talk about Nolan, not Highland, excuse me. Nolan was a multi-year road veteran of the Liberty Amendment campaign. Calls it a far rightist in culture and feel campaign to amend the Constitution so that Congress could only do things that the Congress specifically allows it to do. A bit redundant perhaps, but to such extremes had post-New Deal government led. Now, I need to go through the Liberty Amendment again, because I think my memory is mistaken, because I have no doubt this book is right and my memory is wrong, because I had thought the Liberty Amendment had only to do with abolishing the income tax. So I'm going to need to look that up again, because I don't know what it is that I am remembering there. Okay. Said Nolan had shared pre-St. Louis libertarian disenchantment within Young Americans for Liberty and had tried and failed to get YAF to sign onto the Liberty Amendment. That is really disappointing. YAF really existed for the entertainment of its funders, not for the students themselves. And those old businessmen had no patience for youthful libertarian radicalism. And as we know, they were purged to the youthful libertarian radicals. It said Nolan had a head start from the libertarian button business. In fact, he had a Heinlein for President button he wore during the 1960 campaign. He already had a mailing list of dedicated libertarians. The first place Nolan floated the Libertarian Party idea before a national audience was in an article in the SIL magazine Individualist. He made no grandiose promises for what a Libertarian Party might achieve. He suggested that it could lead to increased media attention for libertarian ideas, which might bring more latent libertarians out from hiding, create a permanent institution to spur those libertarians into action for their beliefs, and help further a breakdown between the traditional right and left by providing a new home, seriously pro-liberty and anti-state, to the forces on either end of the standard political spectrum that ought not feel comfortable with the rest of their coalition. He pointed specifically to, on the left, the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence, and on the right to the Birchers and the Liberty Amendment Committee. The earliest groups of LP activists, reported SIL News, consisted of 75% former Republicans, 36% objectivists, and 16% who embraced Heinlein as their major ideological influence, 23% Missians, and 17% anarchists, though Nolan recalls a far higher objectivist percentage. And I do think that poll that I read from one of the very early LP News indicated a much higher objectivist percentage. It said even the New York Times gave the party's official debut in December on January 31st, 1972, respectful coverage. I'm going to need to get that article. And somebody asked Nolan this question. Now, I disagree with his answer, but it just makes me smile. Somebody asked him, "Isn't that anarchy, Mr. Nolan?" And Nolan's cryptic reply, "Anarchy is simply libertarianism carried to an unworkable extreme." Who's to determine what's unworkable? And if it is libertarianism, then it should be entirely workable, carried to its extreme, or there's a flaw in libertarianism. There's an asterisk. In June 72, the fledgling party first met in convention, assembled at a Radisson Hotel in Denver, with 89 delegates present. I'm going to need to check to see if I had that number. I think I did in the LPD article, but I will check that. Because of some well-phrased comments from the floor during debates over the platform and statement of principles that impressed the rest of the delegation, Tony Nathan, a TV producer from Oregon, left as a candidate for Vice President of the United States. The Hosper's Nathan ticket was on the ballot in only 2 states, Washington and Colorado. Still, it made electoral history thanks to the late Rose Wilder Lane. Lane's young protege and heir, former Vermont State Legislature Roger McBride, and it goes on to say how he was a faithless elector that cast the first electoral vote for a woman. McBride had given courtesy announcements of his intentions to LP higher-ups. McBride had alerted the media beforehand of his intentions under a strict embargo. I didn't know any of that. At that first LP convention in Denver was a California-based investment professional named Edward Crane. Now, I didn't know he was a first delegate too. I need to make sure that he is on my delegate list that I'm trying to compile. His was a traditional young libertarian story. Turned on to political ideas by Goldwater, which led to Rand, some Nathaniel Branden Institute lectures, and subscriptions to all the libertarian zines and newsletters. The Goldwater campaign radicalized him in a way the GOP standard bearer didn't intend. And he said one of those underground newsletters notified me in June of the 72 meeting at the Radisson Hotel. I knew as a libertarian that it was imperative to be tolerant of alternative lifestyles. Until I walked into that convention hall, I had no idea how many alternatives there were. Crane found gold bugs, left anarchists, hidebound objectivists, and even to his surprise, a fair number of free market rightists disillusioned by Nixon on wage and price controls, but still foursquare for fighting Vietnam to certain victory. Because of this, the first LP platform didn't explicitly commit the LP to withdrawal from Vietnam. There was serious disagreement over this among the delegates at the first convention. Now that's a shame, but we do need to note that in LPedia. Crane, and I didn't know he was part of this as well, did I? Maybe I did. I'm going to need to look this up, so maybe I knew he was there, because this is starting to ring a bell now. Crane was part of a team of 8 or so, sitting in a room with Hospers writing the party's statement of principles, a statement still in effect with the controversial line, some LP candidates complain and makes them sound like kooks about how libertarians oppose the cult of the omnipotent state. And then it says at Dallas, with a fresh influx of anarcho-Rothbardians in the party, the platform was radicalized and the unofficial, and this is untrue. It's unofficial in some ways. The part he's going to say is unofficial, but part of it is very official. You guys know that from listening to my lectures on the Dallas Accord. Arose from late-night platform debates establishing the principle that anarchists and minarchists must vow to exclude from the platform anything that alienated either of them. This meant, in effect, that the LP platform must never specify any particular thing the state should do. That was the unofficial part, and that's been broken a million times over. But I don't have a problem with that, since the platform is intentionally transitional. It's the statement of principles that is the end goal. And the statement of principles was amended at that convention, as you know, to be anarchist inclusionary. Then it says Reason Magazine editor and LA-based lawyer Manuel Klausner was an early LP candidate in 72. And it said, while defending libertarianism in a campaign context, he realized he could no longer rationally defend coercive taxation. In his case, the LP, rather than watering down his hardcore libertarianism in the difficult electoral arena, as some radical anti-party libertarians feared it might tend to do, radicalized him. I do think it tends to de-radicalize people. I've seen that way more. I'm glad that didn't happen for him. And we'll see how well I fare when I start campaigning for office, whether I will have the guts, and I pray I do, to keep to my radical roots. McBride, more conservative and traditional in his manner and background than many of the younger LP firebrands, let it be known at the 1975 nominating convention for the 1976 race held in New York that he would not accept a couple of the likely vice presidential candidates who had wide delegate support. John Vernon, because he was gay, boo hiss, screw you, McBride, and Jim Trotter, who was known to have committed the very libertarian crime of owning gold when it was still illegal for private citizens to do so. This is very disappointing to hear. McBride flew himself around the nation, campaigning on his personal jet, cheekily dubbed No Force One, and garnered a smattering of press attention that mostly stressed the zany hopelessness of the LP candidate's task. But soon after the LP's founding, the state struck a powerful blow against it. Ed Crane now says he should have known that the LP would be hopeless as a serious, effective vehicle for winning elections as early as 1974, as soon as the post-Watergate Federal Elections Campaign Act was passed. And it's FECA, is the acronym. Its limits on donations to politicians made it impossible for a small circle of wealthy individuals to support unpopular candidates, which was the lifeblood, for example, of such Democratic campaigns as Gene McCarthy's or George McGovern's, who each had the six-figure support of General Motors scion Stuart Mott. That, bad. FECA, F-E-C-A, fecal, survived a court challenge in Buckley v. Vallejo, a case in which the LP was a party trying to eliminate these new campaign funding restrictions. When Crane was deposed in the case and asked if the LP was intimately connected to any predecessor organization, he replied, "But of course, the American Revolution." That's a great answer. FECA, Crane mordantly notes, is the only law that ever did exactly what it was intended to do: cement the two-party system in an impregnable fortress of cash from which no challenger could ever evict them. The next subchapter is entitled, "Believing we'd be able to engineer a libertarian revolt without massive external backing was very naive." Not everyone in the movement was thrilled with the arrival and rise of the LP. To this day, some blame it for bringing the disparate and multi-leveled energy of the post-New York Times Sunday magazine cover days to a dull, bureaucratic, infighting halt. Louis Rossetto called the party the booby prize that the movement won for all the attention and progress and growth of the early 1970s. Freelance libertarian George Smith, who wrote a great article against Walensky, who was trying to shit all over the NAP, and he defended the NAP, so disappointing for me, at least, to hear that George Smith wasn't a fan of the LP. An old-fashioned voting is crime libertarian. Voting, after all, means participating in and implicitly agreeing to the outcome of a political game, whereby other people's lives and property are considered up for grabs, was disgusted by what he saw as extreme cynicism on the part of friends who became LP insiders. Well, that I can appreciate, because I'm disgusted by LP insiders. The LP's most sincere, loudest, and most tenacious enemy was an anarchist science fiction fan named Sam Konkin, who styled himself the true center and conscience of the movement. For him, said one old friend, the libertarian split from YAF in St. Louis in 1969 was Luther nailing the thesis to the church door, and the light of revelation entering through a crack in the phenomenal universe all in one. The beginning of a true revolution, and the quintessence of all things. Konkin joined the New York branch of the LP in 1973 as a spoiler. From then, he raged against partyarchy, and I call myself a partyarchist, and the corruption of his pure market anarchism with the stain of party politics. Now he talks about very interesting attempts to start libertarian nations. These ideas still exist today, and in different context, a little bit, not necessarily a libertarian nation, but a libertarian state in the Free State Project. And he says, I've discovered bits and pieces of evidence of at least idle plans to create an entirely new libertarian nation dating back to the late 1950s. It was Shirley Rand and Atlas Shrugged and Galt's Gulch, which is just a dumb name, that started it all. That name has always annoyed me. And then, so he talks about, let's see here, the pre-form movement, which was focused on the possibilities of a new libertarian nation. It says, perhaps the first to make a concerted attempt to create an ocean-based libertarian society and not just write about it was a wealthy pharmaceutical firm owner named Werner Stiefel in 1968 under the name Operation Atlantis, and several other names that all had Atlantis in them somewhere. He began recruiting. They coined their own silver money, the Deca, and earned a brief mention in Esquire in September 1970. Operation Atlantis is a real mind blower, Esquire said. They're not just interested in a floating community, but an honest-to-God independent country. How are they going to do it? They're going to build an island, baby, in the middle of the ocean. The Atlantis Project newsletter shifted in 1971 from being priced at 24 American cents to 32 decacents. And the book goes on to talk a lot about these various attempts. And particularly, I'm trying to find the full name of this gentleman, Mike Oliver. And it says Mike Oliver's had one last foray into libertarian nation building. He launched a mid-1990s bid for investors and builders for Oceania using the nostalgic name Atlantis Project. It is memorialized now only by its old website, oceania.org. I'm going to check to see if that's still around. Still online, but glumly reading, the Atlantis Project, which proposed the creation of a floating sea city named Oceania, began in February '93, receiving nationwide publicity from the Art Bell Show, Details Magazine, the Miami Herald, Boating Magazine, and worldwide publicity in Canada, New Zealand, Hong Kong, England, and Belgium. The project ended due to lack of interest in April 1994. And then the next subsection is called Let's Call Coke's Bluff. The LP had been Ed Crane's party, the Crane Machine, through most of the 1970s. Crane was an accomplished man with a professional vision for the LP, who wasn't charmed for long by the peccadillos and amateurism of many in the party, and he wasn't shy about letting them know it. Oh, and he goes on to call him the Crane Machine later on here. I didn't remember that. The Crane team, soon to be known and condemned as the Crane Machine by their opponents in the party, had its own man ready, Ed Clark, a lawyer for the oil company Arco in Los Angeles. Clark was already a proven success in LP terms, one of the two superstars of 1978 for the 6-year-old LP. The other was Alaskan Dick Randolph, who that year won the LP its first state congressional seat. Given Alaska's small population, Randolph was able to win with fewer than 6,000 votes. Alaska would see two other Libertarian Party state legislatures in the 1980s, Ken Fanning and Andre Maru. It has had none in that state since the 1980s. There's a lot of stuff I'm going to be extracting into LPedia from these quotes I'm reading to you. Even before the Clark campaign, prospects for Crane and the LP had been buoyed by a portentous event for them and the entire libertarian movement. McBride had befriended a former Lefebvre student out at a Mount Pelerin Society meeting, a Kansas oil, among other things, baron named Charles Koch, of the Wichita Koch family. Father Fred had launched the family business, now known as Koch Industries, in 1927, developed techniques for squeezing more gasoline out of the oil refining process, and gotten involved in bitter patent wars with some of his domestic competitors. It says academic research and agitation for libertarianism was moving in the mid-1970s from other directions as well. Walter Grinder, an ally of Rothbard's, had, with Walter Block, been running a series of libertarian scholars conferences where academics delivered papers of interdisciplinary libertarian-leaning scholarship. These conferences evolved into the Center for Libertarian Studies, an academic support organization launched in 1976 that gave research scholarships, continued the Libertarian Scholar Conference series, and launched a Rothbard-edited Journal of Libertarian Studies as, among other things, a home to publish the papers delivered at the conference. Man, I keep marking these pages as things to extract into LPedia. A failing of the libertarian movement, Charles Koch tells me, from the perspective of 3 decades of pouring tens of millions of his dollars into it, is that a lot of it has been slogans and unproven theories and hasn't been tested. This gap he hopes to fill with the rigorous development of an inchoate science of liberty that will develop answers as to what strategy is best both to sell and actuate liberty, the personal and institutional values that best comport with a free society, and the best means to make a transition from statism to freedom while causing minimal disruption and pain, some of which seems inevitable as a system that people have come to rely upon begin to disappear. Okay, next subchapter is we managed to alienate a bunch of people on the right unnecessarily. After the McBride campaign, a discouraged and going broke Crane had initially planned on leaving the LP and returning to a full-time investment gig in his beloved San Francisco. Charles Koch, Crane recalls, asked him what it would take to keep him doing libertarian movement work full-time. While not yet completely discouraged by the LP, Crane thought the libertarian movement needed alternative institutions, if only as suppliers and marketers of ideas for the political party. He suggested to Koch that a full-service libertarian think tank would be a grand idea, not an above-the-fray educational institute such as Leonard Read's Fee, but an independent public policy house. He suggested it be located in San Francisco, partly for the libertarian symbolism. This was not to be a traditional think tank scratching the belly of the Washington beast, and partially because that's where Crane wanted to live. The think tank was named, at Murray Rothbard's urging, the Cato Institute, after the series of American Revolutionary-era pamphlets known as Cato's Letters, which advocated a strictly limited, natural rights-respecting government. The Cato Institute began operations in early 1977. It says Evers became founding editor of the magazine Cato launched Inquiry. It was meant to appeal to leftists and progressives who might be amenable to libertarian thinking if they weren't slapped in the face with words such as capitalism and libertarianism, which goes to show, even after the phrase laissez-faire capitalism was taken out of the statement of principles and amended just to the free market, that the LP and the libertarian movement was still thoroughly capitalist. Evers was optimistic. We actually thought that somehow out of the breakdown of legitimacy in government in Vietnam and Watergate, and that young people seemed to be sympathetic to some libertarian basics, plus the fact that our ideals were compatible with industrial civilization and American political traditions, that we had a good shot at shaping the future of the country. The Clark for President campaign in 1980 fractured the mighty Coctopus. It was going so well at first. The campaign season started with a professional convention in 1979, built around the theme toward a three-party system. Crane and Rothbard beat back through intra-party machinations the wishes of many of the LP's National Committee, the Space Cadet faction, and that explains the button that I saw that we have on Alpedia that was part of the button collection that talked about Space Cadet. I had no idea what that meant. Rothbard and Crane dubbed them to dedicate most of the programming to popular libertarian preoccupations with science fiction and futurism. The Crane team thought it would be a crippling PR blow if that were the image the LP presented to the national media that they prayed would be paying attention. Liberal columnist Nicholas Van Hoffman of the Washington Post was an enthusiastic Clark fan, and Clark's press clips were piling up triple and more what McBride's campaign had achieved. The LP's distinctive neither left nor right policy mix with some of the best elements of both seemed zesty, attractive, and worth noting to many columnists. Wish it was that way today. Still, Clark did extraordinarily well for a third-party candidate with a radical ideology, though Rothbard and his friends in the LP's Radical Caucus thought that an attempt to make Clark seem more understandable and palatable to the masses by framing his libertarianism as low-tax liberalism was a grotesque sellout of libertarian principles. Now here's another spot. I had some history wrong or was confused. I thought it was Harry Brown that coined his libertarianism as low-tax liberalism, not Clark. So that is interesting to me that I had that wrong. Maybe they both did. I don't know. And it says, Rothbard's Lenin-inspired devotion to the importance of cadre in a revolutionary ideological movement, a devotion not much shared among contemporary libertarian institutions, led him to object to growth in party membership if it outpaced cadre education. I am not so sure I disagree with him. And seeing how I'm now like the irascible symbol in the current LP, I think I got a bit of the spirit of Rothbard in me. For if cadre, principled and knowledgeable activists, is not fostered, nourished, and intensified, then that cadre will inevitably be spread more and more thin in proportion to the growing number of LP members, voters, and sympathizers. In short, as their number of voters and members grows and the cadre gets weaker, and certainly not larger, the vital cadre member or cadre voter ratio will inevitably fall, which will spell disaster for the LP as an instrument for the achievement of liberty. And I think we've seen that. Rothbard thought Crane's strategy was to soft pedal the more radical implications of libertarianism just to win a wider range of allies and voters. Rothbard insisted, contrarily, that the LP must have the principle and courage to be radical, to hold high the banner of libertarian principle, to urge the principles as well as the detailed political applications in our great platform, to call for dramatic and radical advances towards these principles, and to state our case boldly, clearly, and dramatically. The war between these two approaches has continued in the LP to this day. He declared rhetorical war on the Koch-Crane axis, mostly in the pages of his own Libertarian Forum and in the LP Radical Caucus newsletter Libertarian Vanguard. The Radical Caucus was mostly an alliance between Rothbard and Evers and some younger firebrands from the LP/Students for a Libertarian Society complex, Eric Garris and Justin Raimundo. Raimundo adored flamboyant radical gestures, as do I, including his gay rights pamphlet in praise of outlaws that featured burning police cars on the covers and argued in very strong terms that the state is always and everywhere the enemy of gays, using the short sentence Dan White received for the murder of fellow city official, the openly gay Harvey Milk, in San Francisco as a hook. We did some pretty absurd things, ultra-left things in those days. Some I won't go into out of fear of being terminally embarrassed, Raimundo now says. And in noting the Rothbard spirit I have in me, I hope I do not go the way of Rothbard and end up leaving and condemning the LP as he did. I hope that is not the trajectory I am on. It certainly isn't the trajectory I am on at this moment, but I'm sure he would have said the same thing. And that scares me. Never Again Clark, Never Again Crane is the subtitle of the next section. Although the LP was coming off an extraordinary success by its own standards, the 4 years after 1980 saw it suffering a hangover from the debt the expensive campaign left it in, despite the influx of David Koch money, and it was roiled by fights between a coalition of everyone else versus the Crane machine. The reasons why everyone ganged up on the Crane crew, who had gotten the LP on the ballot in all 50 states and won it a vote total twice as high as the party would ever again earn. This book was written before the Johnson-Weld campaign. Even while fighting against a well-known third-party candidate and a Republican candidate, Ronald Reagan, whose rhetoric was as libertarian as any Republicans during the LP's existence, seemed difficult to discern with 25 years hindsight. Doesn't seem difficult to discern to me. LP founder David Nolan recalls feeling like the Crane crew treated anyone outside their immediate circle with great disrespect, alienating the rank and file and leading them to mistrust Crane and his team. Rothbard managed to get various other forces within the LP, including Nolan and Reason editor Robert Poole, to join a coalition for a party of principle. Its principle: never again Clark, never again Crane. Even the Clarks turned on their former close associate Crane. Clark's wife, Alicia, the LP's national chair from 1983 to 1983, fired O'Keefe with no warning in the middle of a national committee meeting in 1982. This ended up, I think, being the subject of a JC hearing, which just now gives me trauma. She had already... The JC decision in my case is a travesty of libertarianism. The only shining lights, D. Frank Robinson and Mary Ruhr. But everyone else ought to be thoroughly ashamed of themselves. Disgusting. I'm most disappointed in Chuck Moulton, who should know better. She already had her proposed replacement changing the locks back in D.C., while the unsuspecting O'Keefe attended the NatCom meeting and moved the LP's national headquarters from D.C., the center of Crane influence, as the new home of his Cato Institute, which he had reluctantly moved from San Francisco for practical reasons to Houston, where her hand-picked new national director, Honey Lanham, I thought it was Latham, but it's Lanham, lived. The party's headquarters moved back to D.C. in the late 1980s, and we are now in the D.C. area, Alexandria, as you know. Gearing up for the presidential nominating convention for the 1984 election, a libertarian radio talk show host from Orlando, Gene Burns, was the only announced candidate whom all factions seemed willing to countenance. However, the more Burns learned about the actual resources and capabilities of the party, the less thrilled he was at the thought of throwing away a year of his life, and dropped out of the race only weeks before the convention. All factions leapt into the scrum. Two candidates rolled into the convention with juice behind them. From the Crane machine was Earl Ravenel of the Cato Board of Directors, a foreign policy intellectual of real-world heft, a former Robert McNamara Golden Boy. Finally, a candidate with genuine establishment cred, if not candidate polish. Ravenel was hard of hearing and tended to stammer. Lacking much hardcore movement background, he was sniffed at by many LPers as a blank slate who couldn't be counted on to take the hardcore line enthusiastically. The Crane machine took advantage of loose delegation seating requirements to cram the convention floor with ringers. Women who had never seen snow were suddenly delegates from Alaska, and Austrian economist Mario Rizzo showed a sudden interest in the LP he never had before or since. We've tightened up delegation rules somewhat, but not enough. Rothbard and his coalition for a party of principle determined that the most vital strategic imperative was defeating anyone Crane backed. They unified behind old-time LPer David Berglund, McBride's vice presidential candidate in 1976, and LP national chair from 77 to 81. More conspiratorial-minded libertarians were concerned that Ravenel's Council on Foreign Relations membership signaled a possible Rockefeller wedge into the libertarian movement. But it's just a professional organization, Ravenel insisted. The Crane faction scoffed at Berglund. Just a party apparatchik, lightweight, no equal to the respectable Georgetown professor and foreign policy establishment player Ravenel. During a candidate debate, one old Crane machiner remembers Ravenel revealed a weakness that alarmed the party's hardcore. He endorsed compulsory vaccination. See how long it has been that we opposed this? Whew. And Rothbard wept. Berglund won the nomination, getting a bare majority by 1 vote. Woof! I did not know that. Along the way, in a moment of bitter betrayal that reportedly drew tears from Bill Ivers, Justin Raimondo and Eric Garris of the Radical Caucus, which was supposed to be united behind Berglund and against the Crane machine, allowed them to be bowled over by Ravenel's foreign policy acumen and potential for respect from D.C. insiders, and voted for him. The Radical Caucus was rent asunder. Today, nothing could rend the Radical Caucus asunder because they don't stand for anything. I'm back in the Radical Caucus to try to change that. That wasn't the only slight. Roger McBride, Berglund recalls, wrote to the archivist at the University of Virginia, to whom he had entrusted his LP papers, and advised him to throw it all away. The party was a dead letter with Berglund at the helm. Crane and his pals tried briefly to make common cause with John Anderson, their nemesis from the last election. Because of his 1980 run, he could technically be considered a political party and had millions in potential federal funds waiting if he chose to launch another campaign. Crane recalls that they had almost talked him into bringing the anti-Berglund LPers on board for a national unity run, but his advisors talked him out of it at the last minute. Wow. The butthurt moderates, and it seems to me this is always the case, and I'm not even trying to be factional here. This is just an observation. The radicals are always expected to suck it up and take whatever moderate gets shoved down our throats, like Bill Weld. But the minute the tide turns and the radicals win a nomination, the moderates walk away and don't follow their own, oh, you're betraying the party, you have to vote for our candidates line. And that will probably happen again if Dave Smith gets the nomination. It's just disgusting and hypocritical. Okay, next. Okay, yeah, the next title I'm going to do. It's not the next title in the thing, but it's the next one I focused on. It says, these flaws represent very serious distortions in the understanding of market process in capitalist economies. So, despite a renaissance since 1974, Austrianism qua Austrianism is still a misunderstood minority in the economics profession at large. Its centers of influence small and scattered. Its biggest problems to its detractors include its methodological heresies and its ideological connection with libertarianism. Its biggest problem is also what defines it. The Austrian tradition approaches economics with a different style, different concerns, and different preconceptions than the standard neoclassical consensus. In the 1930s, though, Mises didn't recognize the Mengerian tradition as necessarily distinct from or in opposition to the rest of neoclassical economics. It differed from the Lassam and Anglo-American schools, he thought, only in their mode of expressing the same fundamental idea of subjective marginal value. They are divided more by their terminology and by peculiarities of presentation than by the substance of their teaching. And continuing on the Austrian economics, the next subchapter is entitled You Get Involved in It and You're Like You're in the X-Files of Academics. And I didn't highlight anything on that chapter, but I just wanted to show how the theme was painting the way you grow a third eyeball to everyone else. That's how you look when you embrace Austrian economics in the academic world. The next section is called The Exact Opposite of My Views, and it's speaking about Ayn Rand and her hatred of the Libertarian Party. And we are almost done with this chapter. I didn't break it up into segments because I'm not recording on my phone, which makes it difficult to transfer. As the Libertarian movement grew through the 1970s, Ayn Rand alternately ignored and attacked it, not acknowledging that it advanced the same political ideas she stood for. Apparently believing that the notion of a strictly limited government was her own invention, and she just believed that about a lot of things, she alternately declared that libertarians plagiarized the objectivist theory of politics and that libertarians believed the exact opposite of my views. Rand was past elaborating her thoughts by the 1970s, and the Brandons today are perplexed by her ferocity on the subject of the libertarian movement, a ferocity that has only grown hotter in the official objectivist movement after her death. The anarchist streak, or actual anarchism, of many libertarians drove Schwartz to decide that it was not a love of liberty, but hatred of the state that motivated libertarians. I think the one compels the other. If you love liberty, you have to hate the state. To Rand, rational liberty was impossible without a minimal state that enforced a singular set of just laws and prevented what she thought would be the chaotic warfare of competing private defense agencies. But she did think such a state could and would be supported voluntarily. Anything any libertarian ever said or wrote was dragged in by Schwartz as evidence to put libertarianism in the dock. For example, one member of the LP's Radical Caucus suggests that power cannot be wished away, and suddenly libertarianism is all about armed violent revolution. The revisionist history Rothbardian libertarians advocate that emphasizes the sometimes villainous role of the United States drives the extra-patriotic objectivist to apoplexy. Libertarianism provides the grotesque, nauseating spectacle of a movement claiming to support individual liberty and reviling America as the most immoral nation. Their lack of a firm philosophical base makes libertarians nihilists, Schwartz insists. Libertarians want to destroy all values, particularly all moral values, to which they are unremittingly hostile. Schwartz sees no distinction between being free to achieve anything one happens to value, the libertarian notion that liberty is the precondition and background for achieving any and all personally chosen values, and the notion of liberty to achieve nothing in particular. But the zealous, belligerent, purposeless pursuit of nothing is in fact the purpose of destruction. And that is what the alleged post-libertarians are saying today. They're just picking up Schwartz. Note the sudden switching of nothing in particular to just plain nothing. Bait and switch, my friends. Nathaniel Brandon thinks that Rand, if she had bothered to fight through her prejudices, might have come to different conclusions about modern libertarians. Through her unpleasant dealings with Rothbard, Ayn Rand somehow drew the false inference that the majority of libertarians were anarchists. And this ends with a subchapter entitled, "The Fabians Are Yet to Come. We Have to Be the Hardcore Ones." Koch, interestingly, insisted that libertarians must remain uncompromisingly radical. Our greatest strength is that our philosophy is a consistent worldview and will appeal to the brightest, most enthusiastic, most capable people, particularly young people. But to realize that strength, we have to state it in a radical, pure form. The temptation to temporize is strong, because the other side of that is our greatest weakness. That is, because we have a radical philosophy, we don't appeal to people who are in positions of influence, people with status or wealth. So the temptation is, let's compromise. Let's be more gradual than we should be. As a result, we could destroy the appeal to the comers of the world, and therefore we destroy the movement. Koch called out Milton Friedman and Alan Greenspan specifically as sellouts to the system, merely trying to make the government work more efficiently, when true libertarianism would be tearing it out at the root. Amen. And that ends that chapter. Oh, before I close it, the next chapter will be chapter 8, which is entitled A Mainstreamed Radicalism. And it is, I like to tell you how many pages. Ooh, this is a big one. That's what she said. This will probably have to be in 2 parts because it is 90 pages. That's a big one. But we are done with this for now.